Hi, I'm Rosala Mosing. I'm a somatic-based whole life leadership and presence coach.
And I'm Ellen Palmer. I'm a regenerative leadership coach and strategic advisor for purpose-driven women. We're coaches.
And also friends. Welcome to the Presence Hour.
We have cleared this hour to become present to what is and invite you to join us in a lively conversation. We'll explore what is coming up for us and illustrate how cultivating presence can help us gain new insights, perspectives, and ways forward. Let's come together and take the mystery out of presence by getting ourselves there now.
Take a deep breath into your heart, and from here, we'll begin.
Here we are. We're back again. So good to see you, Rosala.
It's so good to see you too, Ellen.
Oh, well, the presence hour. Should we become present and start with a little mood check? How we're each doing?
Yeah, that would be nice. Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I can start. I'm feeling, I'll just say right now, I had COVID for the first time and I'm kind of still tired and coming off of that. So my mood is really uplifted, but at the same time, I feel really grounded and kind of steady because of this sub level of tiredness happening in my body.
Okay.
That's how I am.
Okay. I am noticing that I am a little abuzz with energy and excitement. And as I'm naming that, I'm feeling myself sort of settle in, and I'm finding my sits bones on my seat and allowing myself to ground a little bit more in this moment. So that's where I am.
Nice. Even you describing that your sit bones on your seat, I got that same visualization and feel grounded too.
Thank you for that deep breath. I just realized that I had stopped breathing for a moment as well as I was considering so deeply.
Nice. Okay, so we had a little bit of time to chat before we hit record. And we always start these they're unscripted conversations. And just we see what's coming up for us during our week, during the month, the day, what's coming up with our clients, in our own lives. And Rosa and I did have something that kind of converged. And if you're watching this or listening to this in real time when it's published, it is February and Valentine's Day is on my mind. I'm wearing hearts on my shirt and Rosala has a beautiful red sweater on. So we're feeling the love.
Indeed. Yeah. And it's interesting that the interesting way that we came about this topic was to realize that we both had slightly related but not exactly the same things, and that we're still sort of coalescing and making sense of how we think about or want to talk about these things. So we're still in process a little bit as well. So we're just going to welcome you to come on the journey with us and invite all of your curiosity and as much openness as you can bring, because that's where I think, I know I am coming from, is I'm bringing in some previous judgments and some curiosity and openness. So,
yeah. And I love in conversation, what conversation does is that it helps us further our own thoughts about things that I've been thinking about self-love and its connection to so many different parts of personal development. And human potential and leadership and entrepreneurship and all of these things. And, but like you just said, it's just these beginning of thoughts. And the more we talk about things out loud with each other, with other humans, the more, these thoughts can be furthered. And so everyone listening to this too is what threads are you pulling and meaning making that we're not even making? That whatever comes up for us, what are the other threads that we can continue to pull and bring into our own lives, those creative sparks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Rosa, would you start by sharing what had come up for you this week, the kind of themes with some clients before, and then we'll kind of maybe start tying those into that love or where that sprinkles and connects?
Yeah, so two of the main things that have come, well, I guess three that have come up quite a bit, and for clients and something that I'm constantly thinking through for myself are the big one being self-trust. And, how do you cultivate that? What does it look like? And, sort of parallel to that is authenticity. And then a little less so, but also quite a bit is the idea of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when most people bring up belonging, it seems to be that they're talking about a sense of community or a sense of connection to others. But for me, it always brings up the question of belonging to yourself as well. And so that's where I started with this conversation. And how does that connect? How did we get here?
Connect those dots.
Yeah.
I think the self-trust, when you said self-trust, I immediately thought of this self-love and like what needs to be there to be able to trust yourself.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. Like immediately when you said the word self-trust earlier, I was like, it has to do with like, how can you trust something you don't, love is connected, I think, to trust. Yeah. It's like that safety part of love where you feel safe and comfortable. And that self-trust, because so often we don't trust ourselves. And that's kind of one of those roots. And that's another thing with like when we're peeling back the onion, I know that's like an overused metaphor, but in coaching, that's really what you're doing in personal development and human development, because we only see the surface of our situation. And the more we build our understanding and objectivity, we can go down what's the root. Because when you get to the root or the center of the onion is when you can really start to move those things forward. And so it's like when you have a client, that self-trust is like an issue that comes up. That they don't trust themselves in what they're trying, and that's what's holding them back from either making a decision or feeling confident about making a decision or whatever it is on their plates. It's like, how can you offer yourself love and build that trust?
Yeah.
So I think that just ties with love.
Yeah. Would it be okay to just give a real-time personal example?
Yeah.
So, for example, this idea of self-love is something that I do believe is foundational, and it's something that I tend to shy away from talking about. And part of that is the sense of, if I start talking about this, it might not land right, especially with, clients that are more data-driven or that see themselves in a certain way, or maybe male clients, or, and so I notice myself having a lack of a question about, can I trust myself to bring this forward? What will the perception of me and this work become if I'm talking directly about self-love and the thing that might be underlying or undergirding all of these other things that we're working on? And so I'm noticing, even in myself in this moment, recognizing the tie between the two, and how can I get to a point where I love and accept and belong to myself enough to trust that if I bring this in, that there are places and times, and to be able to trust that I can trust the relationship that I'm in with my clients, to sense into, is this something that would be helpful, or to ask permission and to let it be something that we can then negotiate together, that it doesn't have to be, you said this one thing I don't like, that's it, you're not credible, I'm out. Right? So that's just a really small and specific example to even this situation of this conversation.
Yeah. So I think I'm hearing you say that you want to bring up, like you might see it in a client, that self-love is at, what the thing that's maybe the game changer, or the thing that the person is missing or overlooking in terms of having that confidence they need, or whatever it is. And that you also then are seeing that in yourself, and it's that vulnerability, like that word vulnerable just keeps coming up, that to talk about not having self-love is a vulnerable thing to say.
Yeah, it is. And I find that it seems like it's more acceptable to talk about self-compassion.
Yeah.
Perhaps even, sometimes shame. That one gets a little tricky too, but it does feel more vulnerable to just say self-love specifically.
Yeah, I went down a rabbit hole yesterday of like, okay, how did I get self-love? And how can I help other people? Like, what's my story and how I, kind of wove my way through it? Because what you just said really struck a chord with me, that in the beginning, when I first realized I didn't have self-love, because it was a blind spot, I was going about, I thought I was confident. I thought I believed in myself. I thought, I think I'm fine. I don't, And then when it dawned on me that was actually the thing holding me back, that I didn't love myself, in the self-love, it's really talking about unconditional love.
Right.
That I had conditional love for myself.
Yeah.
And that's when I noticed that I did not have true self-love, that it was all conditional on like, oh, no, you got to do this. Oh, you got to be better at that. Or, oh, no, you're sitting down. You got to go do, the productive stuff, all the things that our identities and worth is tied to. And so it was all conditional. But then for me, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't know who I could say it to, because then they'd be like, oh, you're confident. You're fine.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, actually, underneath it all, I really don't totally accept myself for who I am, and have that unconditional love. And if I'm not going to give it to myself, like, then why am I worthy of it, like, from others? So it just opened a whole can of worms for me.
Yeah. And I think that's, it's interesting that you name that, but I see that a lot where people will mistake confidence for self-love or acceptance. And I see in myself and in many people that I interact with that this sense of achieving or earning acceptance or approval or love, like those are the things that we're doing as opposed to just being.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm done.
That I find that's, and it goes back to why don't people talk about it? Because maybe they don't value it. Is that why is that? That's something that came across when I was trying to formulate these thoughts of how can I position this to get people to know why this matters? Because now that I do have this unconditional sense of love for myself and this living kind of sense of aliveness of love in myself at all times, and a place that I can return to, and how that relates to, we were talking about a little bit earlier, leadership, entrepreneurship, just, your confidence, your resilience. It's all these things that touches and gives me such a steady foundation. But it's how do you make people care about it? Or if you don't notice, you don't have it.
I think that's there's maybe a two-pronged thing happening. I think some people don't recognize that that's, like you described in yourself, you didn't recognize that was what was missing, or that was something to look at. And I think maybe there's also, I don't know if people, I'm not sure that there's a common understanding of what self-love actually is. And so I think sometimes, I know in my own mind, as much as I believe in the idea and the capacity and the value of it, there's also this part of my brain that turns it into this sort of woo-woo, or one of two things happens. It's either becomes a sort of woo-woo, esoteric, thing, and or it feels like a condemnation of myself because I'm not already there, or pressure to be able to bootstrap my way there, and which doesn't feel easy when you're not in that place, and I'm not sure how to get there, or so then it just feels like it's further condemning and shaming me for not being there, and so then it starts this loop that makes it harder and harder to get out of if you're paying attention, right? So that's what I've seen in, both in myself and in many friends, clients, social connections of any kind.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why this came up for me today, when we were thinking about what's relevant and with presence and what's happening with clients, and I would say almost every client that I've ever worked with, this is something that is there, whether or not we've talked about it or raised it to the surface. Yeah. It's connected to all of the things. Like I was writing down, I was like, perfectionism and people wanting to work on confidence, people working on communication, people working on imposter syndrome, or like that leadership can be really lonely. Mm-hmm. And, burnout, talking about resilience. And so back to like you said, like that kind of shame entering, like I'm not there yet. I don't have this. And it kind of is a feedback loop that kind of keeps you from self-love because you're condemning yourself for not having it. And that resiliency work I do with the nervous system is that it's all about meeting your own needs is what's going to help you regulate and find that regulation and that love and that sense of belonging and safety and connection is love. So like love is the cure. Mm-hmm. Because like the judgment is the thing that pulls you down and makes you dysregulated, that shame, whatever, and keeps you from self-love. It's like the defense mechanism. So it's like we're all like our bodies are kind of designed to protect ourselves from self-love. Like don't let it in. Don't let it in. Because if we let it in, then like we have to admit that that there is such a thing as unconditional love. Because that's what I've been trying to put my finger on is like, what are we so afraid of letting in? Like our own power, our own, what?
That's an interesting, I hadn't thought about this, but that's an interesting potential competing commitment or idea is if we can experience unconditional love with ourselves, I wonder then how that might reflect on some of what we're calling love that we're accepting in our life from others might hold up. And so that might be another tangent for another day, but that's interesting to me.
Say more about that.
Well, I think, we talk a lot about unconditional love, and I think especially when we're talking about parents and children or spouses, things like that. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, you might internally feel a sense, I think especially mothers to their children, this might be most applicable for, but this is something that my partner and I talk about a lot is that he just doesn't believe in unconditional love because, and I think there's a distinction between having unconditional love for someone and having an unconditional capacity to accept any behavior.
Yes.
And allow that to be in your life. Yeah. But I do think that it is difficult for us to love others unconditionally because there are behaviors. And so separating the behavior from the pure love of just another spirit, another human, another, and if you can think about the essence of that person, which is difficult, I think, for us because we're meeting the personality. And so what we get and give from each other often, which makes sense if we're not giving ourselves unconditional love, it's very difficult to give it to others. And so if we begin to give it to ourselves, maybe there's an unconscious fear that, then this outside thing doesn't measure up, and what will I do with that information?
Yeah. So I think that is so rich, Rosela, because I think, it's all about judgment and judging the behavior that is unacceptable. So we all have our own personal construct and biases of what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable. Every one of us, right? Like we all come with our own set of what we think is right and wrong. And that's what, what I think prevents love, self-love and self-worth. I was like, what prevents it in me? And it's really like the inner critic, the inner judge, the thing that's judging. So you're talking about judging the behavior, right, of others. And if we give them unconditional love, then we're accepting some of their bad behavior or their values or something that we don't agree with.
Right.
But we're doing that to ourselves in our heads like all the time, where there's like, I had a very strong sense of, and it's that perfectionist. We've talked about this before, like perfection is strong gene. I'm an Enneagram 1. So that's like, if anyone knows what that is, you'll be like, we got her pegged. But I've been really growing into my growth edge or whatever that is, that is to go beyond that perfection, because I was always judging everything I did as right or wrong, every teeny micro movement. And when I first moved into like naming my business Freedom, Growth, and Joy, the first part of freedom that I was seeking was like relief from my own inner critic in my head.
That's relatable.
Yeah. And when that voice, when I sent that love and I sent it love, and I just kept trying to send that judging voice like love and care and compassion every time it came up, like putting my hand on my heart and breathing and smiling into my heart and shifting to that every single time, over and over and over through repetition, it got quieter and quieter.
Yeah.
And suddenly I had this newfound sense of like peace and quietness in my brain and in my thoughts and in my body. And I was just like, I kind of didn't know who I was anymore. Like for a little while, I was disoriented because I was like, it was so quiet in there. Like I didn't have all those judging thoughts. And it's totally true for me anyway, that when I stopped judging myself so harshly, I stopped judging others so harshly.
Yeah.
Like my family that I was the closest to, my husband and my 2 children, that I was raised with, like a grandparent, my Nana, she was an Italian woman, she was very right and wrong. Like, you do this is right. If you don't do this, get in line, get in line. And so like, I always kind of had that same, like, I just am trying to make people better. Like I'm trying to help my son reach goals and be better. But really it was all this like never enough, never enough.
Yeah.
Which is that juxtaposition against the unconditional love.
Yeah. And I think that's an important aspect that you just named is I think it does come from, I think this resistance to it does come from a protective place of like, if I just accept myself and all of my flaws, what will motivate me to get things done, to be a better person, right? If I'm just going to, so I think that's a real fear. And also it's a lie. It doesn't, it doesn't, it to an extent will help you get things done, but then what is your experience in that?
Yeah. And it's, been proven that we've talked about this, I think even before on our podcast, is that like shame doesn't motivate you.
Right.
Like it's been proven and researched thoroughly that shame does not motivate you.
Right.
But what motivates you is like empowerment and, positive thoughts and let's go. And so it's like we're self-sabotaging, all of us, through our old pattern behavior of not allowing us to love ourselves unconditionally. Because no one was taught to love themselves unconditionally. I don't know a single person who was taught that in their family system.
I agree. And, I want to, if it's okay, go back for just a moment because you talked.
And if you're out there, good for you. I love that you're out there.
Please,
I'm high-fiving you.
Please reach out. Let us know because we'd like to talk to you and learn. But I want to go back for just a minute, if it's okay, to talk about, you named a couple of specific practices that you do, like putting your hand on your heart, like breathing, having, we talk about this in our intro, this sense of breathing into that space of smiling to yourself or to your heart. And those have been, as well as for you, they've been transformative practices for me. And I can remember a time in my life when they might have been difficult for me to do. I might not have been able to access that or tolerate it.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening and that's where you are, I want to first normalize that is where many of us started. And share... Or are now, even now there are moments where that comes first and then I have to remember, oh, right, I can. But where it starts for me sometimes is I first notice that the judgment is happening. And sometimes I'm even in that moment not capable of actually giving myself the love I need because the judgment is so harsh. So where I start is I just notice that judgment, that inner critic, and some, there are lots of people make that into a characterization and give it a name. So, but I don't necessarily go that far, but I just notice it. And what I sometimes will do is I'll say the word cancel, or I'll say the word, that's not my thought. Just something to recognize that while our thoughts are in us and are part of us, they are not, it's not the sum total of me. And there are other parts of me that are not subject to being that thought. And so I can separate myself a little bit in that moment. And so sometimes that's enough. And sometimes that's enough to get me to where I can do the next, give myself a little bit of embrace myself, caress my own face, tell myself, I literally say to myself every day, I love you, Rosala. And when I do that, I actually have a visualization practice where I imagine my spirit self, my essence, the things that are true of who I am, regardless of my circumstances. And I imagine that part of me showering down love on this flawed, imperfect personality part that is afraid or, is making mistakes or, that has the parts that I don't necessarily think I like. But I recognize that those parts are also serving me in some way. They're here to protect me from something. And so I can still give them appreciation for the job that they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's interesting. So you said you do cancel, or what is that? You name it as a thought.
Yeah, that's not my thought.
That's not my thought. Those are good. Those, it's like for the clients that I do work with where this does raise to the surface, and we are working directly on it, I always say it's like find something that works for you, because it is so unique and different to what calms us and what feels loving and caring to us. Yeah. Like mine is, I just say, I send you love. I send you love. I put my hand on my heart and I say, I send you love. And I've done that enough that I don't always have to put my hand on my heart. And I do think, and then I just want to call out what you had said, that you say to yourself every day, I love you, Rosala. And when I started doing that practice myself, because I also did that, it felt so awkward. I was like, I don't even believe it. Like, I'm like, why are you even, this is the weirdest thing. Like, why are you even saying this to yourself? And then now that I'm working with clients and I suggest, as an invitation, is like, this is something that you could try, is to actually say to yourself. And I just want to, like, for all of you listening, yes, it sounds corny. Yes, it will, like, almost every client I've worked with has said, like, I don't believe it. Like, it doesn't land. Like, you say it to yourself and you're like, who am I talking to? And you kind of look around, like it feels like that.
Yes.
But when we're working with the neuroplasticity of our brain and we're trying to re-pattern an old pattern, because we're all wired with a negativity bias. And I just heard something like 80% of our thoughts are negative. And that's like that old neural pathway that's just so ingrained in us. So it's like, how do you repattern to have more positive thoughts? It's like possible through our neuroplasticity of how our bodies are designed. It's that repetition.
Yeah.
And so if anyone wants to play with that idea of where do I enter into self-love? How do I start exploring this? That's a great place to start, is just to really, like, say it to yourself, even though it sounds like super corny and it might be really weird at first. But did you experience it different, like, as you continued to say it over many months? Yeah.
So I will say, when the invitation was first offered, I was resistant, and I tried to say it, and I had the same thing. Like, this doesn't work. This feels corny. And I've tried saying it in a mirror. I tried different things. And I will say, looking at myself wasn't helpful, at least initially. Although now I can. Yeah. And I can now look at myself in the mirror and say, I love you. And I can look at even my body and actually love my body. And so I will say that it did feel very awkward at first. For me, that visualization and kind of separating, so it felt like it wasn't just me talking out loud to myself. So it feels like there's distinct parts of myself. So something is giving the love and something is receiving the love. Yeah. That part felt important to me. But I will say, yes, over time, I've been in this practice for probably about a year now. And over time, it got from really awkward and uncomfortable and ineffective to tolerable to, okay, this is kind of nice, to this is really empowering. It's really comforting. It really shifts my being. It really shifts my mood. It shifts. And so sometimes I'll do it throughout the day if I'm having a particularly busy, it doesn't even have to be stressful, but busy day where I just need to be reminded. Or when I'm having difficult moments. I don't always catch it in the moment, of course, but but I do try to start my day that way at least. So I'm creating that foundation.
Yeah. That's one important thing too, I think, I'm like reflecting as I'm hearing your story, also reflecting like what were the moments that kind of like changed and helped. And it's like because repetition is what like you need to repattern. If anyone's listening that thinks about how do you repattern an old pattern, it's repetition to create that new neural pathway. And so it does matter. And I think for me, and it sounds like you too, that I did it before I got out of bed every day. Like I would lay in before I got, like I would wake up and before, because, if you just wake up and you start going and you're, whatever, I would lay there and I would say it to myself. And in the beginning, maybe the first year I had a hand on my heart and said like, Ellen, I love you. And I would feel this sense of love and I would try and like feel it in my body to see if and at first I couldn't. But the more I did it, it's like my heart like woke up or something. I mean, it's really remarkable, I think, over time, how it changes. And now sometimes if I feel really distant from that, where it's like I'm not feeling it in my heart or going back to it, but I have this image of like paint when I'm laying in my bed, as if like the paint or is like coming down my whole body. So I'm painting my whole body with love. So it's kind of that outside in thing that you said helped you, that sometimes it feels like it's more successful if it feels like something from the outside coming into you. And so that just is like a whole body experience, and it just relaxes. It like brings down my nervous system. It's very calming. It feels very nurturing, very comforting. It's like those love emotions. And I've heard another group called Heart Math, they suggest you, and I think this is based in Buddhism tradition, is that like you just bring up a feeling of the heart and an experience that you felt at some other time. So if you remember looking at a child or a pet or a beautiful view and focusing on bringing up that sensation of caring or kindness or gratitude or love, and then working with that, but like turning it on yourself.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll say one other thing that I didn't mention, but for me, I don't actually do it in bed. But what I do is I try to, so for me, part of the external is I do a version of that 3-dimensional centering that we did in our last episode. That's part of how I start my day as well. So when I do get out of bed, I will do the 3-dimensional centering. And this is part of, I've attached the I love you to that. And so sometimes I do it in a really brief, like in a 30-second version. Sometimes I do it in a much longer version. But so then I also have my physical like being and orienting to physical sensation and dimensions of my body. It has also been an anchor for me to make it more real and in an embodied experience, as opposed to just this idea in my head of the words.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely one of those things that I think that you just really have to feel it. And that's why at first it does feel so foreign, because you can't even imagine what it feels like.
Yeah.
And then once you practice it and bring it in, then once you have some sensation of it, it can continue to grow over time.
Yeah.
And so what Rosa was just referring to was in episode 4 at the very end, the guided visualization at the end. Rosa brings us all through it's like your full dimensions of yourself. So we feel into our length, which is represented by our dignity. And sometimes I call it your worthiness. Then we feel into your width, which is your sense of belonging. And then we feel into our depth, which has to do with our sufficiency. And before we hopped on today, Rosalind and I were chatting, and I was like, that was one of the realizations that I had, that all of those dimensions, the worthiness, the belonging, and like the sense of enoughness and sufficiency, is all connected to love and my love for self and feeling that within the body. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it really is. I was like, I've been doing that practice for, was it 2 years now? Three years now. And just dawning on me that it's really just an expression of my own love or like knowing my own expression of love for myself. That I feel worthy, that I feel like I belong, and I feel like I'm enough, period.
Yeah.
Not like if this, and this, like how I was dominantly before. Now it's a quieter part of me. It's still there. But I just think it's a big, if anyone's listening to this and you could be like, find yourself on that continuum. Like, can you not feel it at all? Can you feel it a little bit? Do you feel it often? And just know with further curiosity and exploration of allowing it in, it will grow over time. And it's not like a magic, like, oh, do this or do that, but it really has to do with whatever comes up. Can we go back to, you had said this, it goes back to acceptance. Like you were talking about accepting other people's behavior. And that's why we can't give unconditional love, because then it seems like we're condoning the behavior or the values. That comes up a lot with my clients. Like when they have like someone else at work that they're in conflict with, it's because they have a value disagreement with that person. And so they really feel like they can't accept that person. And so I've played around before with like the idea of acceptance. It's different than condoning.
Right.
And it's the same for yourself. So it doesn't mean I'm going to be like the sloth, like you were saying, like we feel like if we give up this inner voice that's always making us better and motivating us to be better and do things better and be better, that if we have unconditional love for ourselves, that we'll be like content or satisfied with status quo or something. But it's so far from the truth. It's more like, all I can say, like, this is still iterating in my head, but is if you send that thing love, whatever it is, like, okay, I did screw up on something at work. Like I didn't email someone back and it was a client that I probably could have had like a bigger consulting agreement with. And I didn't email them back because I had COVID and I totally dropped the ball and I missed a deadline. And I can be like, but I can still love myself even though I missed this big opportunity and things that were important to me, and I didn't follow through on that. But that doesn't mean I'm not learning from that and being like, okay, next time I want to make sure I can follow through and live through with my values of responsibility and achievement and all of the things, but I can still love myself. It doesn't sacrifice my worth or my sense of belonging, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like, I love that you brought in the idea of the learning, because what's coming to my mind is if you imagine, if there's someone that you do love or maybe even a little pet that you feel is very innocent. But if you think about, like, if you're teaching a little 4-year-old to tie their shoe, and it's a 4-year-old that you think is very precious and that you love with your whole heart, when they make a mistake, you don't shout at them and tell them that they're worthless or a loser or an idiot. You give them encouragement and love. And you maybe show them again, or you maybe just sit patiently and say, it's going to be okay. You're going to get it. Right. And imagine being in those two conversations and having those two different responses and how the child might respond and what that might do to their learning and ability to tie the shoe and their willingness to want to even wear shoes. Right. And that's a little bit, I think, what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah. And I think this isn't for everyone, but I think that we have all been, not all of us, but that in that example that you gave, some people were yelled at that they couldn't tie their shoes. I actually think a lot of people were raised by dysregulated adults. And I even know when my children were really young and I was working full time and like leading an organization, and I was snappy and short, and I was not always regulated and darling and loving and kind to them. And so I think, is that where how did we all get here that we can't love ourselves? I heard from several psychologists that they say that our inner voice is like the voice of the adults in our lives when we were like 0 to 3 or something. And that's the inner voice that we hear following us around. And so I think that's like a learning of like, so if those are our two choices, how can we come into presence and come in, because in presence is where choice exists. And that's why, as like coaches, we're always talking about presence, because change and coaching is all about making different choices than those automatic patterns. So how can we make that choice instead of yelling at ourselves because we're not tying our shoes fast enough or doing whatever we're supposed to be doing? How can we meet ourselves with love and compassion? And I just keep going back to like, what stops us from that? What makes us think like we're not worthy, or that is dangerous for us to let in unconditional love?
That's a big, it feels like a big, big question. And I think there's a lot of things that do. And I'm wondering, and this is also, I'm thinking through this in real time, but I'm wondering how valuable it is to even know what stops us versus how do we begin to meet ourselves where we are, and how do we begin to, through presence, make conscious choices, even if that is right now that I'm going to choose to continue the old pattern because that feels safer for me, but to be able to have the self-determination to choose it consciously instead of it just happening to you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that what you were just talking about, I think, leads back around to one of the original points that I was making and ties into this. And it's something we talked about a little bit before we got on the call. But this idea of feeling the pressure to need to like fix yourself or bootstrap or, and the idea that tying it into these voices that were, I think, not even between 1 and 3, from in utero to 3, perhaps. And the idea of, to use a little bit of technical jargon, but we're referring to, I'm going to refer to something called polyvagal theory, which is really talks about how our nervous system operates and regulates itself and sends us messages. And I really like the way that you talked about it, Ellen, with the 2 buckets of the co-regulation and the self-regulation. And I think that that's something, the co-regulation part is something that we so often overlook in our society. And I think, like, to your point of being the parent who was working full-time, who did have little time and lost your patience, that starts in utero. We're being bathed in our mother's nervous system and her ability to regulate from before we're born. And then we're in an environment where that person's nervous system and their ability to regulate and to be that gentle, loving, encouraging voice is either present or not on some continuum. And for those of us that didn't necessarily have a stable, regulated nervous system, that's how we learn to regulate. And so it becomes much more challenging to do the self-regulation part if you don't have that external. So you were mentioning some really great resources for that. Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, so I work with that resiliency of the nervous system is basically like your stress response that just quickly, because we can't go too far into it, but your nervous system is there to protect you. This part of your nervous system, the autonomic part, is your sympathetic, which is like your stress response, and your parasympathetic, which is more of like a calming, regulating. And when you are feeling regulated, both of those are kind of bobbling around 50%. And that's when you feel good and regulated. And then I say, like, if you go for, let's say you go for a jog, your sympathetic nervous system goes up. And then to recover, your parasympathetic goes up and helps you recover, and your sympathetic goes down. But nowadays, we're living with like an overactive sympathetic nervous system, that our nervous systems are detecting danger everywhere, either from a full inbox or the news or whatever. So we're always kind of overstimulated, and then what you were just talking about, Rosala, like when we come into this world and are raised with dysregulation, we don't even know how to find regulation again, how to get our nervous system to be that flexible, dynamic, kind of bobbling around 50% of both parasympathetic and your sympathetic. And what we're taught is go off on your own and regulate, learn how to self-regulate. Like, I don't know, it's like becoming more mainstream in like leadership and corporate ease of like, oh, emotional regulation is one of the key leadership qualities. Like, go get that. Or like women showing emotion in the workplace as leaders is like for years, like not okay to show emotion. So learn how to regulate. And so we're taught we're supposed to do that by ourselves. But how our nervous systems are designed in this polyvagal theory that Rosala brought up is we can co-regulate our nervous systems. So we're all like sending out vibes into the room. Like if you walk into like a meeting and people are upset in the room, you can feel it. Or you walk into your house and a family member's upset, you can feel it. So we're all like picking up off of each other. And if it feels like a warm, caring environment, you feel more warm and caring. And so that's us co-regulating. And so think of it as like we have two tanks in our body, like two tanks of energy that where you feel good. Because like if my kid, like back to the tying of the shoes, if I have a low tank, I am going to overreact to him not being able to tie his shoes. But if I have a full tank, then I'm going to be like kind and caring, whatever. And the same thing happens internally to ourselves, right? We're kinder with ourselves when we're more regulated. But what we have is a co-regulation tank, not just this self-regulation tank where we're off there on our own. So the co-regulation tank, you can co-regulate your nervous system with other people or pets that you feel safe with or connected. You can co-regulate with nature. Everyone wonders why they feel, oh, nature helps me feel better. Oh, I always feel better after, that's why, because our nervous systems co-regulate with it. So it helps us, or basically calms that sympathetic nervous system response. That's what's happening in our bodies. If you're safe in nature, that is. And then with a higher power, you can co-regulate with a higher power. So if you think of yourself having two fuel tanks, one is the co-regulation tank that needs to be completely full or full-ish before you can go and self-regulate on your own.
Yeah.
And that's that, like, we didn't have parents with those co-regulation tanks filling us up. And so how does that, and how that's impacted my life with my kids, that I purposely go and co-regulate with a higher power, with nature, with friends, with loved ones. And that is that sense of belonging that you were talking about in the beginning too, as a theme that was coming up with your clients, is the sense of belonging, is that connection where you feel connected to others, you feel connected to a broader sense of the world. That's what I'm talking about with this co-regulation tank. And then you can go self-regulate.
Yeah. Yeah,
is there
I agree.
More light to that or more explanation?
I think I just want to maybe add a little nuance to. I think maybe the higher power one might not resonate with everybody, and so I just invite you to think about what is something that is bigger than you. Is it the whole planet as a whole, maybe living energy? Maybe it's, for me, part of it is that vision of myself, that sort of essence, true nature part of myself that I see as bigger than just this personality. So there's ways to think about that energy. Yeah. Maybe it's just, all of the collective unconsciousness of the planet, however you want to think about that. But there's ways that you can work with that even if you don't have a particular spiritual identity, I will say.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, one other thing I just want to say, because you talked a lot about this being up, higher, needing to kind of downregulate. The other side of that is sometimes when we've been up too long, then we kind of cascade down and get into more of the shutdown freeze space. And so it kind of does both.
The up Rosala's talking about is they're sympathetic, that like stress response is too high for too long, and then you get shut down.
Yeah, and so I think it's the co-regulation isn't just necessarily to bring you down when you're too high, but it can also help lift you up when you're too low, when you're in that like collapsed feeling state.
Yeah.
Which is works both ways, interestingly. So it's not just that it slows you down, it can help with both.
Yeah.
That was all I had to say about that.
Yes, totally. So I feel like we went off on a tangent there about the co-regulation and regulation tanks, but it's really like, to bring it back to self-love, I think it's what I heard you saying where we got into this is like, don't feel like you do have to do this alone. Like it can be in that whole like, oh, I should be able to do this alone. I should be able to do this alone. And it's The feeling that self-love is sometimes just like if you do have a pet and you're sitting there petting that pet and you have that feeling of like that's the feeling that you should like be like, oh, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And like really just opening yourself up and turning it on yourself, which is like allowing it in. We talked about like, how do we allow this in, or what are we protecting ourselves that we don't allow it in? But another framing of this that we talked about before the call was this is kind of feels like when you're moving into more and more self-love, it feels like a becoming, like a flower unfolding, because love can be so expansive. But at the same time, how I was like experiencing it and feeling it, it's kind of like a returning home, like you're shedding layers. And it's like that love was always there inside of me. I just like pushed it away and didn't want to see it or feel it or know it. And now I'm just like discovering it. So now it feels like, I bring it back into like the leadership work I do. It's like this center. It's the confidence. It is the motivator. It is the authenticity you brought in the beginning. It's the belonging. And it just like lives within me. So it's like whenever I kind of forget about it and I'm getting caught up in the day-to-day, whatever it is, it's like it's always there. Like if I quiet down, it's just like in there. And it's because I watched for it. Like when I was in nature and I had that feeling, I was like, oh, this.
Yeah.
Or being with that friend and feeling really close and connected. And then I'd be like, oh, it's this. Like I feel it right now talking to you, Rosala.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
And I'll say for me, it even maybe goes a little bit, I've gotten to the point where it doesn't even feel like it's something within me. It feels like this is who I am.
Yeah.
And I think that's, well, I don't know for sure, but I have a sense that might be true for all of us.
Like that essence you were talking about. That essence,
I think there's part of that is just pure love.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm biased by my own experience of it and that being part of who I see myself to be, but that's what I'm currently playing with.
Yeah. And that's what it feels like to me. I've read what other people have said about it. And I did that for years where, I went to church when I was younger, when I was very young. And that whole idea that they would say, oh, God is in all of us, or, whatever part of, and it just seems so conceptual to me. Just like, when we were talking about that self-love, or when you say like, oh, when I wake up and say, I love you, Ellen, it would seem conceptual. Mm-hmm. But it is getting those little glimpses of, oh, this is it. Oh, this is it. And it is that like that true essence. That's kind of like the shedding to get to that true essence of what it feels like to me, literally.
Yeah.
And then also that blossoming. And I think that's more of, we haven't talked about this, but like the expression of, and that's where I tie it to authenticity, is that I just feel like I am love, which does sound, corny in some ways, or, whatever, but I really feel like that. And then when I do the things that I'm doing, like when I'm coaching or whatever I'm doing, I feel like I'm an expression of love. Yeah. So that's that blooming flower metaphor. Yeah. If I just feel like it's an extension, and I just feel that's my true expression of who I am, which is my authentic self, which helps with, back to those leadership qualities of like confidence and belonging and whatever. And then we were also talking about those entrepreneurs. Since Rosala, you and I are both entrepreneurs. It's the thing, like, I don't think I could do this. Like before, I wanted to have a steady job, a steady paycheck, a steady everything. And I could never imagine doing anything else. And the more I've developed self-love, the more I'm like, feel more comfortable in this like entrepreneurial space.
Well, yeah. And that goes back around to the self-trust, because now you're in a space of, there's a lot of unknown in front of you. And, navigating that takes an ability to trust yourself, to be able to navigate it, to trust that, circumstances will meet you where, in support of what you're trying to create. There's just a lot, which it feels like we could go down a whole another path. And I'm also recognizing that we're kind of coming up on our time, and we also want to get into a practice. So is there anything else that needs to be said in this conversation today, or where are we?
So I'm pulling on the self-trust to bring this. I mean, we started in the beginning and bringing it back to that. And it's just like, I go back to that, even if you don't believe it, that like that I love you, like to have that, to try and turn unconditional love on yourself. Mm-hmm. The invitation to try, and the invitation to make steps, and it's like the welcoming and softening. Because I think self-trust is like that to me. Like when you're trying to build trust with any relationship, it's like a kind of a pattern of like, okay, that was good. Okay. A little softening, and you feel softer and softer and more welcoming the more that trust is built. Mm-hmm. So it's like, just start building that trust with yourself, that it's okay to feel unconditional love no matter what, even if like you screw up or you're not this or you're not that or whatever.
Yeah. And I would just add to that don't, experiment. Find what actually feels tolerable or like love, or, what actually feels right to you. Like go off script. Don't necessarily use the specific things we've named if they feel helpful, or if you need a guide to start. Yeah. But also, this is all an experiment, and you are the expert of you. And so, maybe practice experimenting with trusting yourself to try things, and that it might be what's right for you.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm so glad we talked about this, Rosala. This is exactly what I wanted to talk, I just think, it is February. Love, let the love wash over you, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. It's coming from Rosala and I to you right now. I hope you can feel it. Are we ready to do a little guided visualization? And this one is it's basically like you just named, Rosala, an experiment with sending yourself love.
I am ready and excited.
All right, let's get into it. So last time I guided one of these, I was moving back and forth between my microphone, so it was a little choppy. So I'm going to try and do the best I can to stay an even distance from my microphone. But if it does get a little in and out, I apologize in advance. So I'll just invite everyone to get comfortable in your body. Just settle into your body. And what I mean by comfortable in your body is like find a comfortable seat, or if you're walking, just find a little bit more ease. If you want to adjust any clothing to get more comfortable, do that. And if you're available to allow your eyes to close, I invite you to do so. And if you are driving or walking, it's totally fine to keep your eyes open. And do what works for you to get grounded in your body, where you feel connected to the planet, feel gravity effortlessly holding you here. And as you maintain that sense of groundedness with gravity, I invite you to find an ease and a supportive lift in your posture. And start to focus on your breath. I invite you to place a hand on your heart and allow your breath to start to slow and to deepen. We often all exist in our minds with our awareness centered in our thinking center. So at this moment, I'm going to invite you to give your thinking mind permission to take a break. So you can let go of any thoughts in the past, what we were talking about, let go of the meaning making, let go of preparing for what's next, and begin to drop your awareness down into your body, moving from your head down into your heart. And if it helps, you can imagine you're walking your awareness from your brain down a staircase down into your heart. Or perhaps you can imagine your thoughts and your awareness being a cascading waterfall flowing down from your head down into your heart. Begin to focus all of your attention on the breath in your chest. Feel the rise and fall of your chest underneath your hand. And then begin to imagine that you're breathing directly in and out from your heart space. So imagine that the breath is entering through your heart, through your hand, into your body, and exiting out of your heart through your hand. And for the next minute or so, just continue to find a soft, easy rhythm of breath in and out through your heart space. It's okay if your mind wanders, just anchor yourself back into breathing from your heart. Just in and out. And now that we have our full awareness on our heart, I want you to ask your heart what it needs. Ask your heart what it needs and listen to the message your heart has for you today. Just notice what comes up. Is it emotion, a sensation, a phrase, a longing? Whatever it is, just stay curious and be with it as you continue to breathe in and out of your heart. Now I want you to imagine that in your arms, a large, warm, cozy blanket appears. And this blanket represents your love, your compassion, and your care. I want you to take that blanket and softly wrap it around whatever came up for you. Wrap yourself in that love, compassion, and care. And now I want you to repeat to yourself the following phrase as you rest in this soft blanket. I send you my love. Repeat it to yourself again. I send you my love. And a third time, I send you my love. And then sit in this embrace. Give yourself permission to accept this love. And feel that warm embrace of love and care. Feel free to stay in this embrace of love and care as long as it feels good to you. And if you are ready, you can begin to wiggle your toes and wiggle your fingers. Find your breath in your body again. And open your eyes when you are ready. And with that, we are complete.
Thanks for listening. We want to hear from you. Drop us a comment on what you'd like to hear more about or questions you may have. We value your input and we'll work those topics into future episodes.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others. Like, subscribe, and leave a rating and review. It would go a long way in helping us spread the word about the Presence Hour podcast. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.